There's no climate change response that can work without the world's biggest emitters, because over half of CO2 emissions come from 4 territories: China, the US, Europe and India. India produces more than 6% of CO2. It has a population of 1.4 billion, and its next move matters.
We need such action at a high speed, on a large scale, and with a global scope. We in India are doing our part.
That may be, but since 1990, India's emissions have risen sharply. That's directly related to the transformation of its economy.
About 100 million people still do not have access to electricity. And we are talking about still a quarter people facing poverty. So in that situation, and when a lot of infrastructure is yet to be built, so the development deficit is huge, which means emissions are going to increase.
And emissions have increased. India is one of the biggest emitters, but look at its emissions per person and you get a different story. India's per person CO2 emissions are 1.9 tonnes. Compare that to 7.1 in China, or compare that to the UK, which is 5.5. Now, unlike the European Union and the US, India doesn't have a target to reduce its overall emissions. Instead, its target for 2030 is relative. It's committed to slow the increase in emissions linked to economic growth. And because India's economy is growing, that target actually means India's CO2 emissions will grow. Now, the blue line here shows India's on course to emit less than its target. Climate analysts, though, say India needs to do much more. They say it must follow this yellow track to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. But there's resistance to take on more. The Indian Minister for Climate Change said recently, we should not be shifting goalposts and setting new benchmarks for global climate ambition. Now, there may be a desire for consistency here, but the government is also aware that setting harder targets will be, well, harder. This is why.
India's coal belt helps power this vast nation. More than 2/3 of the country's energy production still depends on it. Such is the demand that the country's planning on building or expanding dozens of mines in the coming years, and also continues to import coal.
And the demand that Rajini Vaidyanathan describes connects to India's economic development. To some, this is non-negotiable.
India cannot live without coal. Our country is a developing country. Coal is one of the major resources for Indians. If we stop the coal production under the pressure of the world community, then how can we maintain our livelihood?
The answer here may lie in moving from one abundant resource to another, from coal to sunshine.
It is cheaper to build a solar farm in India than anywhere else on the planet.
And India wants 40% of its electricity capacity from non-fossil fuels by 2030. It's expanding output to 450 gigawatts, but it has a long way to go.
Now, at present, only 100 gigawatts of installed renewable energy is being produced in the country. And definitely, it's much behind the targets and the need.
Now, India argues it can only hit these targets with financial support from developed countries. Let's hear from the campaigner Harjit Singh again.
Finance is absolutely key. And this is where we don't see international community really coming forward. The numbers that you see are not real numbers. And we are stuck to that $100 billion. But we know that we need trillions of dollars. Where is that kind of money? It's not coming through.
And while the developing and developed world manoeuvre over funding, 2030 remains a key year. By then, India wants to radically increase what's called its carbon sink, its ability to absorb more CO2. India is aiming to plant 10 billion trees to assist doing that. And for all its undoubted challenges, some, including the US, see India as an example of how the developing world can address poverty and climate change. Here's John Kerry again.
India is a world leader in demonstrating economic development, and clean energy is not a zero-sum choice, one or the other. You can do them both at the same time.
Perhaps this is right. If the world could match India's emissions per person, global emissions would be far lower. But there are tensions in India's approach that remain unresolved. Here's the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, again.
our lifestyle is still rooted in sustainable traditional practices. Guiding philosophy of back to basic must be an important pillar.
The problem is that as developing countries lift their people out of poverty, back to basics is rarely part of it. As people gain wealth, they travel more, buy more, consume more, and the economies that create their wealth are industrialising. All of this creates emissions. If India can develop and cut emissions, it will help create a blueprint for many countries. But it's not there yet.